Back in 2003, one of the biggest and, let's be honest, most controversial military campaigns of this century got underway. Today, we're going to peel back the layers on the invasion of Iraq, why it happened, how the war itself played out so fast, and the absolute chaos that followed, which, is still shaping our world today. All right, let's get into it.
It really all boils down to this one single question. Why? Why did a massive US-led coalition invade a sovereign country? To really get the answer, you got to rewind and understand the mood of the entire world at that moment.
You see, the story of the 2003 war doesn't actually start in Baghdad. It starts in New York City and in Washington, D.C., right in the terrifying aftermath of the September 11th attacks.
After 9/11, everything changed. There was this new pervasive fear in Washington. What if a so-called rogue state got their hands on weapons of mass destruction and gave them to a terror group like Al-Qaeda? That fear led President Bush to label Iraq, Iran, and North Korea an axis of evil. Things escalated pretty quickly, and by March 2003, it all came to a head with a final ultimatum. Saddam Hussein had 48 hours to get out of Iraq or face an invasion.
And this quote right here, it cuts right to the heart of the argument that was presented to the American public and the world. Now notice, it wasn't about connecting Iraq to 9/11. They had nothing to do with it. The fear was about a potential future attack, one that could be even more devastating.
So, this is where it gets really tricky. You had this fundamental disagreement. On one side, the US and the UK were absolutely convinced Saddam was hiding these weapons. But on the other side, you had UN inspectors literally on the ground in Iraq saying, hey, we're not finding any evidence of this stuff. It was this complete clash that eventually led the coalition to go in without the UN Security Council's blessing for war.
Okay, so let's shift gears and look at the actual war plans. Because when the fighting did start, the two sides were basically preparing for two completely different types of wars. It was, well, a collision course.
The coalition's plan, called Operation Iraqi Freedom, was all about speed. It was a blitz. The idea was to just blow past the cities in the south, use pure velocity and surprise to confuse the bigger Iraqi army, and make a straight shot for Baghdad to cut the head off the snake.
But here's the kicker. Saddam completely misread the situation. He thought, at worst, he'd face another air campaign, kind of like what had happened before. So where were his best troops, the elite Republican Guard? They were positioned to watch his old enemy, Iran, or to put down a coup at home, not to stop a massive armored invasion coming up from the south.
And even though Saddam was acting confident, this quote, it tells you a very different story from inside his own military. Some of his commanders knew. They saw the tech gap. They knew the Americans weren't coming all that way to get bogged down in the desert. They knew what was coming for them. And so, on March 19, 2003, it began. It kicked off a 3-week campaign that unfolded with just, well, stunning speed.
The opening airstrikes were literally called shock and awe, designed to paralyze the Iraqi command structure. The ground troops poured in almost right away. Now, the advance was fast, but it wasn't a total cakewalk. They ran into some really fierce, unexpected resistance from paramilitary fighters in places like Nasiriyah. But the game-changing moments were these thunder runs, these incredibly bold armored charges right into the middle of Baghdad that just shattered what was left of the city's defenses.
Thunder run sounds like a clean military term, right? But this raw, first-hand account from an American tank sergeant, it just reminds you of the brutal, horrible reality of fighting in a city. The morning commute got caught in the crossfire. The cost for ordinary Iraqi families was just devastating.
And then came this moment. This was the image that flashed across every TV screen on the planet. For millions of people watching, this was it. The war was over. It was framed as this moment of pure liberation, just like the fall of the Berlin Wall. The mission, it seemed, was accomplished.
But here's the thing. The fall of that statue, it wasn't the end. Not even close. It was actually the beginning of something much longer, much messier, and much more complicated. The military victory had created a total vacuum. This image became the symbol of that quick win. Now, technically, the banner was just for the aircraft carrier's crew, but to the world, the message was clear. The war is over. But on the streets of Baghdad, a whole different, much more dangerous reality was just getting started. And this is where the entire narrative just flips on its head. First, the main reason for the war, the WMDs, they were never found. None. Then, with Saddam's government gone and literally no plan for what came next, the entire country just collapsed. It created this enormous power vacuum, which led to insane levels of looting and laid the groundwork for a vicious insurgency.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to what it was like for the people living there. This quote from a shop owner in Baghdad, it just perfectly captures that feeling of total collapse. The army had just melted away, leaving their guns and uniforms right there in the street. There was no law, no order. A modern country had just dissolved into chaos.
So what do we mean by a power vacuum? Well, think about it like this. When the coalition officially disbanded the entire Iraqi army and the police force, they basically got rid of the only people who knew how to keep order. That decision, plus not having enough of their own troops to secure the country, left this giant void. And that void was very quickly filled by militias, by insurgents, and by foreign fighters.
The human cost was immediate, and it's just staggering to think about. An estimated 7,400 civilians died in just those first 3 weeks of fighting. And tragically, that number would be completely dwarfed by the hundreds of thousands who lost their lives in the years of insurgency and violence that came next.
So we're left with this question. The stated mission, removing a dictator, was achieved, and with incredible military speed. But by doing that, a new, far longer and far deadlier conflict was unleashed. It really forces all of us to ask, what does victory even mean? And was the mission ever really accomplished at all?